Our new sermon series today has to do with the jobs we do in our daily lives. So I wanted to start out by asking some questions pertaining to your work or the work that you've had throughout your life. So just raise your hand if any of these questions apply to you. So raise your hand if you have worked the same job your whole adult life. Okay, a few people. Raise your hand if you've had a number of different jobs throughout your working life. Okay, a lot more of you. How many of you have a job that didn't exist 10 years ago? Okay, there's a few people with newer jobs that have been invented. Raise your hand if you deal more with screens and machines than with humans. Raise your hand if you deal more with humans than screens and machines. Okay? Raise your hand if your main work is running your household. Raise your hand if you travel a lot for work. Raise your hand if you mostly work remotely. Raise your hand if you live to work, that like people around you or you yourself may have called yourself a workaholic. Okay, I noticed on the Wednesday night service, like there were reluctant hands, but like spouses or children were like forcing the hand up of those who are the workaholics. Raise your hand if you work to live. It's the paycheck that's important. Okay, and let's see, there's a bunch of kids here. Raise your hand, kids, if you know what your parents do for a living. Okay, now I want you to tell your parents, if they're near you, what you think they do for a living. Okay, parents, if you have kids around you, did they get it right? Raise your hand. Did they get it wrong? I mean, a lot of people have complicated jobs that maybe their kids don't know the exact title or what they do for work. Now, one last question. Is your job secular or sacred? Now, the way I worded that question was not helpful, and I did that on purpose. And it's also a trick question, because every kind of work that we do, no matter what area of life it is, whatever the job we have, every kind of work can be an opportunity to connect with God and connect with those around us. So every job could be both secular and sacred. I think we often divide those things and we think of our faith life in one category, and like we come to church, we have prayer time, and then we think about the rest of life as the real world, where we've got to make tough decisions and do a bunch of stuff, and our faith may not have anything to do with that, so we think. This sermon series that we're starting today, called On the Clock, is our opportunity to explore how our connection to God impacts every area of life, even our work life. And so On the Clock is about our vocations. And I said the word vocation, not vacation. So if you all of a sudden started planning a tropical vacation, no, it's vocation. So come back to that. The word vocation means calling. And we all have callings in our lives. We can have callings as a worker, callings as a student, or as a retiree. We also have callings based on our relationships, callings to be parents, partners, children, grandparents, siblings. We have the calling of being friends, of being community members. And oftentimes we have a bunch of multiple overlapping callings or vocations in our lives. Martin Luther King Jr. had a really great way of helping us think about our callings. He wanted us to think of our callings in a three-dimensional way that has length and width and height. And when we live into our callings, in all of those dimensions, we really are fully living with purpose. And so he had a picture he liked to describe of a cube. So when we think about the dimensions of a cube, the length of the cube isn't how long we work or how long our life is, but it's our drives, it's our ambitions, those things that move us forward. So we think about calling from that perspective of ambition. But he also wants us to think about calling in terms of width, and that's how we care for people around us in our calling. So you think about, how do I live out my ambitions and my drives, but also take care of the people in my family or my community, my coworkers, the people that God has placed in my life. And then when we think about height, it's our connection to God. So when we think about all three dimensions, we're balancing our drives and our ambition with caring for others and being connected to God. And I think sometimes we often limit our understanding of vocation to just one of those dimensions. Which one do you think we might limit our understanding of vocation to? Any ideas? Length, our ambition. We think about, where am I going in my career? How am I going to pay the bills? How do I earn a bigger paycheck? What's in it for me? What are the benefits? And those aren't bad questions, but that's limited. Because if we really want to live into a bigger purpose, we not only think about our own ambition, but we think about caring for others, and we think about our connection to God. And I like how our reading from Colossians today, it helps us practice living fully into our vocations in all of those dimensions. To refresh you, it starts out by God saying that we are chosen ones, and God calls us holy and beloved. And then we're invited to clothe ourselves with these 5 traits of compassion, kindness, humility, and patience. And then it reminds us to bear with one another and to forgive each other. Because anybody living out a full vocation has to deal with other people. And so bearing with one another and learning how to forgive one another is so important. And what I love about these words from Colossians is it shows us the things that we can control and the things we can't control. In life, there's all sorts of things that just happen to us and we don't have control, but we do have control over how we respond to it. But one of the beautiful things we don't have control over is that God has chosen us. We don't have control over that. God says, I have chosen you. I am calling you holy and beloved. So we just are going to have to be stuck with being loved by God. But then God says there's some things you can actually choose. You can choose your attitude. You can choose how you will relate to the people around you with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. And these words may sound soft or mushy or flowery or poetic, but these things are hard to do. And these are things that we fail at. These are things we need to be forgiven for because we actually mess up, and the people around us mess up in practicing these things too. So forgiveness becomes really important. But I want to redefine some of these words for you. When I looked at the original Greek in the Bible, I think there's some better descriptive direct translations for some of these words, and I may end up ruining some of these words for you, and I apologize. The first word is compassion. The direct translation is bowels of mercy. I don't know what to do with that. But compassion in this sense is reaching deep down to find mercy for others. And I think we can maybe most identify when it's hardest to give that mercy, when we would rather not. But this really says that compassion needs to be something we have to dig deep for. And mercy is something that you give when it's not deserved. The next word we may not like, but I like the better definition, is meekness. The translation is actually restrained strength. We often think of a meekness as weakness, but restrained strength is actually what it is. It's we have strength, we have this calling, but we use our strength to care for others, not to bulldoze over them, not to steamroller over them. So it's a restrained strength. And then I'm going to wreck one word for you, the word patience. The direct translation from Greek is long suffering. And I bet you have all prayed for patience at some point in your life. But how many of you have prayed for long suffering? I bet not many of you have said, "Dear Lord, make this very terrible time last as long as it possibly can." Okay, that's not the intent of the word long suffering. The intent of this word is an understanding that suffering happens in life. Even those of us who are trying to be faithful to God, we will endure times of suffering. There will be times where we have difficulty in our relationships, we'll have difficulty with our health, we'll have difficulty in knowing which direction we should go in life, and that just happens by living. Long suffering means, God, how can I move forward through this time that I don't know how long it will last? How can I be faithful to you? How can I find coping skills to get through this time of suffering or struggle that I'm in? So when we pray for patience, we're actually praying, God, just help me keep moving. I don't know how long this thing is that I'm going to have to struggle through, but help me keep moving forward through it with your presence. So these words, compassion, meekness, patience, these aren't easy words. And we know what kindness means, but that's not easy either. And we know what humility means. It means to be humble, and that's not easy. And forgiveness, we know what forgiveness is, but I think it's the hardest thing of all. Practicing these qualities is something we're invited into, knowing that we will mess up. And that is why God continually gives us forgiveness. And hopefully we, as we continue to receive forgiveness, can grant forgiveness to other people who also fail at showing these beautiful habits of faith. Now, Paul, who wrote this letter to the Colossians, he had some other words to contrast with the 5 beautiful qualities we're supposed to be practicing. And as I said, these were new Christians, and they followed other gods before, and they had another set of values that they lived by. So Paul said he wants people to rid themselves of their old values and the old ways they operated, and he wants them to follow different ways. So let's look at the old ways. He says, now that you follow Jesus, rid yourselves of anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language. Now, I actually don't even think these 5 words were values that were taught to people. I think these things just come naturally to us, especially if we're stressed, if we're tired, if we're overwhelmed. No one has to teach us to be angry about something or to talk badly about someone or someone else or be abusive. And that's hard, that can be a natural tendency, especially under times of stress. But Paul is saying God has called you to something new. And you won't always master it, but God has called you to a new way of being. So let's look at the new way of being again. God has called us to pray over and to practice this 3-dimensional way of living into our calling, of practicing compassion and kindness and humility and meekness and patience, knowing that there will be forgiveness when we mess up. Throughout this next month, we're going to be talking about various ways we live out our vocations, our daily work, and how we can choose what attitude we bring, how we can serve God and serve others in those vocations. And we're also going to be watching some videos with some of our congregation members who share about why they do what they do. And I hope that it sparks some conversation among all of us of finding purpose and meaning and asking some great questions and finding some breakthroughs and seeing how God is present in our daily lives. And we've called this series On the Clock. And we may have the luxury to be on the clock and off the clock between our working life and maybe our at-home life. But here's one thing that makes me so grateful, is that God is never off the clock. God's chosenness of us, God's choice to keep on loving us is permanent and real and everlasting. And that's something that we can be grateful for as we think about our response to God.